So this morning I woke up early to finish my book, and as the first rays of light were peeking through my window, I was leaving realms of epic quests and legends and courtly love that turns into transformative love to have to log into my 9 to 5. And it was quite an abrupt shift as the end of The Everlasting by Alix Harrow absolutely wrecked me. This was a beautiful book that I think fully realizes Harrow's potential. As much as I loved Starling House last year, I think these two books have really built into what I could see the potential of her early books being, and I think that this really was transcendent in a lot of ways, to maybe use a little hyperbole. But The Everlasting continues the kind of 2025 trend we are seeing of kind of medieval inspired fantasy, and particularly lady knights. And here we have a scholar who is thrust back in time to come face to face with the legend that he has based his entire career around, but not only his career that has shaped his entire life, as he has also served in the army that she inspired him to enlist, and how her legend has shaped his life. And so he finds himself face to face with her, and the awe of it, and also the devastating realization as he has gone back in time that he has essentially been sent to ensure that she meets her tragic fate in order to protect the future. However, time is malleable and things change, and this is not the first time these two meet, and it will not be the last as they find themselves again and again at the yew tree. This is a story about a scholar and a knight, but it is also a story about love. Love of ideas, of story, of country, and also the kind of love for a person that you will burn the rest of that down for. It's a story about power, who wields it, and how those that wield it come into it, and how much someone will sacrifice not only for the rise to power, but to stay in power. And it's a story about propaganda, the stories that build legacy and build the ideas of who we are as an individual, but also as a people, and how that shapes our societal construct, and how much of that is truth and how much of that is myth, and where the two combine, and also how we can play with these ideas, how mutable these ideas are, and how we can envision a better world in whatever way. And so as much as it's a story about propaganda in a lot of ways in the context of the novel, it's also a story about stories and the power of stories that is in direct conversation with the current moment through the framing device of this story being told to us. But before we dive all the way into the story of Una Everlasting, or just Una, and the scholar Owen that immortalized her. Hi, my name is Melody, and we talk about books and book-adjacent things on this channel, including, ideally, every Friday sitting down to dive deeper into a specific title. So if that sounds of interest to you, I would love for you to like and subscribe and hang out a little longer. If you're already subscribed, thank you as always for being here. And go ahead and hit that like button if it strikes your fancy. But with that, let's go ahead and return to this kind of epic story of Una and Owen, which is approached as an epic story in many ways, or in that tone of a storytelling tradition. And I really appreciated and loved the way we entered this story, both the framing device and the point of entry of the story, as well as the voice and the tone. And that is saying something, because a lot of this book is in second person. However, a very focused and directed second person, which makes all the difference. So how are we entering this tale, which in many ways is exploring or playing on the kind of legend of something in the vein or the tradition of like Arthurian legend, especially if we're looking at something like Owen getting and or contributing to the death of Una Everlasting as a text and comparing it to something like the Morte d'Arthur. So there are these parallels, which I think are very thin purposefully and invoke a lot, and also are part of that conversation with the current moment we're having, especially in relation to the history and the parallels we see especially in the original timeline we're exploring, where Owen has gone off to war at one point and come back a celebrated war hero, though he believes that this is not earned valor in his case, and the way that Una was used as a national symbol to send people to war and to build up the national pride to encourage this. And there are a lot of parallels that we see historically there, especially if we're looking at this idea of kind of Arthurian legend or the legends we tell nationally as any group in order to justify that kind of fight. And so there are some parallels within that original timeline that strike historical chords that I think are also then meant to kind of strike contemporary chords in the kind of parallelism, which I think was very smart too, in terms of the kind of idea of the parallelism of this piece of history repeating again and again within the context of the narrative, and looking at that in the way that time ripples and history repeats itself, though as the saying goes, it doesn't repeat, it echoes, and the way that we see those echoes even within this story, and also kind of looking at the kind of porousness and mutability of oral tradition and storytelling, and the way these kind of myths kind of build on themselves and write themselves and rewrite themselves over time through the lens of different peoples, and then looking at that and framing that within the context of time travel and history kind of rewriting over things, I think was just such a smart context for this book. And none of this concept is really a spoiler because we are introducing the different sections of this book as the first death of Una Everlasting, etc., up through the fourth. So we have downgraded from the six deaths of the saint, which is an Alix Harrow short story, essentially. I don't think it's full novella length, that is available, I think, particularly for Kindle Unlimited. And I actually read in preparation for this because I'd heard some early reviewers, and I am also technically an early reviewer in that I read an ARC, so thank you to Tor for providing a digital ARC for review for this. But I saw some early reviewers talking about how this book felt like a continuation or inspired from the Six Deaths of the Saint. And so I read that first to kind of see how they were in conversation with each other. I'm very interested in how writers kind of build on earlier ideas or are inspired by earlier concepts and take them in different directions, in the same way that I have talked about how in Mariana Enriquez's Our Share of Night, there is a kind of echo of the short story Adela's House from Things We Lost in the Fire, and seeing those connections and how they have grown and changed in between the two iterations is really compelling. And there are definite conceptual echoes here, and you can kind of see, or I can kind of see how she was toying with this idea in the short story, and it really solidified here, where Owen in The Six Deaths of the Saint, if you want to kind of transpose directly, is a more kind of nameless shepherd figure, and there is a difference in terms of the villain being a king versus a queen, which I think is very interesting when we're looking at the ideas of the patriarchy in this novel very directly, which we absolutely are over the course of time, and this idea that a woman has been in power for all of these years as the queen. Una is serving the queen. Una, as this legend, as this mythic figure, is a woman who exists in between in a lot of ways, in the way that she is presented and perceived, and also to the way, or down to the fact that she is called Sir Una, and the way that it is made clear throughout the narrative that the patriarchy is still at the center here, in the sense that the villain, who has a large impact over the story and a certain power over time and place and history, is still within the most current timeline of whatever given point of the story, at the mercy of the men of that current moment in a patriarchal society. And that is very deliberate and a very interesting piece of that conversation that I think is explored in the kind of undertones of the novel. But we're approaching the story at first from the concept and the perspective of a scholar who's getting to realize the dream, right, of getting thrust back in time and coming face to face with not only, again, the subject of all of your academic pursuits, but really the guiding light and story of your life, coming face to face with Arthur at whatever moment, or whatever the equivalent would be for you, for whatever Greek myth maybe has kind of really lived large or loomed large in your history to the umpteenth degree, unless, of course, you have a degree in that particular myth. And so he has been given this opportunity at the beginning of the book, before even that, basically the opportunity of his career to translate this text and the kind of dream and realization of a primary source that has lived in legend that is confirmed and that he will be able to translate. And so it's this kind of building. And then it's taking this idea of the myth that he knows and the legend of Una and what that is, and her mythical quests and her eventual sacrifice, which is alluded to later within that first bit, admittedly. But realizing that he is there to ensure that her destiny remains the same. He sees these kinds of moments of doubt, or these indications that maybe the lines of the story as he knows it aren't really playing out exactly in this moment. And so he is kind of guiding her along the path as he knows it, and is transcribing these stories both from her and from the people he encounters along the way, on their way to slay the last dragon and return the cup to the queen to heal her and cement this legend. But things become much more complicated than that when Owen has to face the idea of Una as a human, as a person, as flesh and blood, and as something more, and reconcile the fate he's sending her to with the person he has come to know and love in whatever way. And also this idea of love over the course of the novel, which morphs and changes through these different iterations of the tale. So even as Owen is telling us this story, he is telling us very specifically. So it's this kind of a first person, but really second, because it's directed with lots of yous, where it's clear that he's talking to Una directly. And there are occasions as well where we will get Una's perspective later in the novel, when it is kind of a way to twist the expectation of the audience and to twist what is known in terms of us having seen things through Owen's point of view only. And so it is a conversation, and even the framing of the book itself, the story itself, is playing on, again, that idea of oral storytelling, but also just the kind of myth making, the way that myths and legends grow and change over time, because it's partly that oral tradition, this idea that he's collecting stories along the way, but also just like the different versions and iterations that get passed down, which is referenced from the very beginning of the book when he talks about like an early child's version of Una's story that he receives that is his first introduction to Una, but how it's not the most faithful text. And so as readers, there is that kind of like nerdy excitement over exploring this idea of what is the correct text or the original text, but then also the realization and the exploration that all of these texts may be real in whatever timeline they exist within, and the way that the different versions and iterations of that myth then impact a future or a present. And I would argue that even though the beginning timeline of the book seems to kind of mirror an alternate history that's closest to our own reality, the closest, that the different iterations of the storytelling or the different deaths within the framing of the novel get us closer to reality or the present in some way, in the sense that within that first timeline, we have an Owen and an Una who are not meeting for the first time, because we can feel the echoes. And here's where I think it's smart too, in the sense of where it's dropping us into the story, because it becomes clear to us later that this is maybe not the first meeting, but it feels like the first meeting to us as readers. It's set up in that way. And even if we can feel those echoes later, that's then what we are basing everything else against by the nature of that being our first encounter of this story. And so we're able to have this really interesting litmus against which to gauge everything else. And also, we have this idea that this is an ongoing thing, that this wheel has been turning for an age already. And so it has already kind of taken us out of time in that way. However, when we start, we have the kind of most idealized version of, again, an alternate medieval, but we have all of this imagery that's really invoking like Arthurian legend, even with like these echoes in the words that are kind of invoking something like Avalon or pieces of Arthurian legend and kind of twisting on that. Because I think it's the most recognizable, or I would argue it's the most recognizable kind of medieval legend, this idea that we have in the current age of knights in whatever way, that is where it comes from, as well as the idea of courtly love, which is where we start the novel. And excuse me, because I don't think I've really dug into the idea of courtly love since my humanities sequence in college, but I was fascinated by the idea of it here. And I think we see echoes of it as well in the Legendborn cycle, so maybe something to revisit deeper at another time. But we start with Owen and Una with this idea of courtly love, if we want to call it the longing, the yearning that we're longing for, this idea of something untouchable is evident, but it's also more than simply yearning at the start. So from like a narrative point of view, we have that great baseline of yearning, which is really satisfying. But then narratively, we are also playing in this idea of courtly love, which is focused on the kind of unrequited devotion and often involves some kind of infidelity, which we don't really play in here. We play in the idea that Una has had a life before Owen is there, but not that she is, taken in whatever way that creates some kind of barrier between the two of them. Time and the repeating of their story is barrier enough and is an obstacle in and of itself. But the idea, especially in the first iteration, that Owen is still, even as he is confronted with the humanity of this myth and this legend, and he is reconciling that as he goes about this last quest, he is also not willing to profane the ideal of her with these human desires. And again, this isn't like a full deep dive of courtly love because I don't think it's a perfect kind of transposition, especially when we're looking at the ideas of gender roles, especially being really played with and immersed in this in both of our leads, and this idea that both of them deviate in some ways from specific gender expectations of them in whatever timeline, and how that kind of helps them exist in this kind of in-between as well, this liminal space of time as we look at it is really satisfying as well. But because of that, there's a lot of really strict gender roles within the ideas of courtly love. But this idea of it being transformative as well, which I absolutely think we see here. Now, within the, more traditional context, it's about this idea of, the quest and the unattainability of the love being the refining power that allows a knight to kind of realize his higher self in whatever way. But here we're seeing two characters really on a quest and fighting for this love that they've realized in whatever way, and reconciling the world around them as well, and trying again and again to make all of the pieces fit together. At the same time, we are exploring this kind of contrasted or juxtaposed against the idea of power, especially in relation to Vivian specifically, who is the one who originally sends Owen back in time on this quest in an effort to ensure the future remains the same, and the ways in which she has tried to manipulate the past to ensure the present throughout a long timeline, and the lengths at which, or the lengths to which, she is willing to go to attain power and to preserve power. And so we see the corruption of that, but also we see these two characters who, at the beginning of the novel, are all too comfortable within the power structures as they have been established and really work within the rules of their world in that way. They don't challenge things. And this is particularly emphasized by Owen's father, who is another veteran. And so while he's originally introduced to us as essentially just a drunk, we also later see him protesting, complicating this idea that Owen has of him in his point of view, especially in this first section, where we also see Owen kind of complicate things for himself over the course of the novel. And the way that we see the layers of myth and narrative bleed into each other over the course of the novel for our characters is really satisfying as well. So there's this kind of bleed over of the different timelines in some ways. So we see the seemingly small changes that lead to even greater changes, but we have even down to the way the chapters or the sections are introduced, where we kind of start back where we began with Owen and we get the same little blip of an introduction to his world and his dreaming of running away and, just farming some goats and having a simple life. And the way that that starts to even bleed, where he starts to question his own mind, even in that moment, the fragmentation and the fracturing of that, and the breakdown of the world as everything kind of compounds, which does then kind of lead back to a question about the beginning, because Owen feels very staid and settled in his perception at the beginning. However, I do think if I went back for a reread, I would find those cracks already, which were very satisfying. And the whole book, again, I think there was a kind of suspension of disbelief I was willing to accept because it was being told in many ways like a legend or a myth, and sometimes like a fairy tale, depending on the section. And there was that connection to a more straightforward narrative structure, while it was also playing in these realms that allowed us to kind of live in a little bit more flowery of language, and also to explore these more thematic explorations that at other times could venture into the didactic in a way that I think that it really avoided here, because again, we were already playing in the realm of these like bigger ideas and what ideas these myths and legends create. And so there are just pages and pages of sections that I highlighted, like you had been born poor, but no one had ever called you a poor thing, or already ancient here at the beginning of everything, or what is a man against a legend. So there was this really epic feel to the writing, as well as there was a lot of symbolism throughout the novel, especially in relation to the idea of the yew tree that was the kind of central kind of connector for Una and Owen particularly, which is symbolic in its own nature, and I think succeeded in the way that some of Harrow's symbolism for me in the past hasn't. Yes, I'm still holding a grudge against that tower. I think that this was much more kind of grounded, rooted, if you will, in a tone that already supported and allowed for it. I think that it made clear the symbolism without beating over our heads that, hey, this is what a yew tree represents. It allowed it to live in that kind of higher exploration and just be what it was while having these extra layers. And that symbolic kind of stand-in really carried over for a lot of the different explorations, I think, at the heart of this book, whether it be kind of like the idea of power that I talked about, this idea of othering, the idea that even though Owen has devoted his entire life to Dominion as a country, as a nation, he will still be seen as other by so many in that nation. And so there are all of these pieces that work together, and also this idea that symbolism in that vein or in that nature returns us to the idea of the myth and legend of the kind of Arthurian ilk. Like, that is the bread and butter. So it fits within the style and narrative device that we're pulling from as well. So I think that that's a really happy marriage. And we see things like the symbolism of the Red Knight for Una, which kind of invokes or calls back to the idea of the Green Knight. But we have those pieces that are all part of a larger conversation, as the different echoes of the story is part of a larger conversation, and what future we will build for ourselves out of those pieces of story. Honestly, there are so many pieces of this to dig into because there's all of this kind of narrative framework going on, right? But I still had a very emotional reaction to these characters at the same time. And I think this kind of repetition and this idea of watching them try again and again to get it right, and the struggle of that and the devotion of that, was incredibly cathartic to see that play out again and again, and to see the change, and to see them reaching out for each other and grasping each other, and see the love develop between these two, even as we have it alluded to in the way that the second person's working early. So we have this kind of foreshadowing to where we may be going, the kind of emotional revelations of that, and then we get to see it realized. And the beauty of these two characters in particular, where they feel so separated from everyone around them, and this idea that they are in many ways an island unto themselves, and how they can see each other so clearly in their kind of bareness. And there's just a real beauty to that, that again is very personal and character driven, and then also has this kind of larger symbolism and epic quality to it. And I think that it also really succeeds in invoking this really epic scale in a much shorter, tighter book. This isn't a long book, and even that, you could trace back to, the fragmentation of pieces of story. We have, larger tomes of Arthurian legend, and we also have fragments and the way that all of it comes together. And so we're seeing these very specific pieces of a larger story here that is working together in a way that makes us feel connected to something bigger, and also have this really distilled, impactful, emotional punch that also is in such direct conversation with the current moment. It was emotional for me to be reading this, especially, with what Chicago is going through right now. I think that there was something really powerful in it, and looking at these different iterations of past, present, and future, and kind of envisioning what that is and what our stories are. I think that this is a novel that is filtering through this kind of myth and these echoes and permutations of myths that may be more familiar to us, that is in very specific and direct conversation with the current moment, is a novel of the current moment filtered through the past, and is exploring the way that myths and legends are really a reflection of our present. So, it has like the big scale stuff, but it also has that really solid emotional center with Owen and Una in particular, a really satisfying antagonist that is devious, but also complex, and also possibly an immortal horse. So this is a very stylized novel. So I think if you're looking for something much more straightforward in the narrative, this might not be for you, which makes sense. I really enjoyed the risks it took narratively, or, kind of the freedom it took narratively in its storytelling. I thought it really utilized that well and made it work, and was inventive, and it served the story and was in larger conversation while still giving that real emotional punch and resonance as well. So I absolutely adored this. I think it's definitely one of my favorites of the year at this point, and I am sure that we could have many side conversations about little pieces of it, and in that way I think it would be an excellent book club book. I think I might suggest it to my book club, who has read other Alix Harrows when it comes out in paperback, but there is so much to dig into with all of the different layers of this. I think that there is a lot to talk about in that setting as well. So if you've read this, I would love to hear your thoughts. Thank you as always for hanging out and listening to mine. Like and subscribe if you feel like it. Read something good. And yeah, bye.